started to cry. Their voice rose as they pulled some more on her hand. It seemed forever until they got what they wanted, Mommy's wedding ring. Pointing to her ears, they said something again and proceeded to take her earrings. Seppi stood on the one side of the bed, next to the bed, not saying a word. He stood glued to the floor. My grandmother came out of her room and stood in the doorway. In shock at first, she started to cry and lament. At this point, I became even more frightened. The partisans said something else to my mommy and Mutter, pointing their guns. I could not understand what was said or what was going on. Why were these terrible men in our house? The next memory I have is of walking along our street. It was cold and dark. The whole street was full of people. People in front and in back of us. The whole street packed all the way across. I was on the outside left of the road, holding on to Mutter's hand. Afraid and bewildered, my grandmother held on to me with one hand, and the other she carried a small bundle, crying over and over. Was machen die mit uns? Mein Gott, Jesus, Maria, and Joseph, was machen die mit uns? What are they going to do with us? My God, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what are they going to do with us? I began to cry. If grown-ups didn't know what was going on, there was good reason for my fear and horror. We kept on walking. Every time Mutter lamented, I would look up at her pale face surrounded by the black kerchief tied on her head. I can still see her next to me with the dark woolen Berliner Dichel, the big woolen shawl she used like a coat around her shoulders, holding on to me as if we were driven out of town and into the night. They drove us past the cemetery, out to where they had taken all the young women and men who were shipped to Russia before us. The airplane hangar were to be our home for most of the next 2 years. They came during the night. They took everything. Our right to sleep in a bed, to eat our own food, to take care of our bodily functions in privacy. They drove us from our homes at gunpoint, young and old, male and female, from the just born to the oldest in their 90s, driven out the gate like our animals by their herders. But instead of loving keepers with dogs and whistles, men with rifles and bayonets herded us out of town and into the barbed wire enclosed airplane hangars. Now we were also considered beasts of burden. But unlike livestock, which was cared for and protected, we were to be abolished as a people. At the tender age of 4, I was considered an enemy of the people, a Nazi, a word that no 4-year-old could know the meaning of or what it stood for. The saddest part of all was that the rest of the world was meanwhile rejoicing. Peace, peace was being shouted from all corners of the Western world. Never again would such inhumane treatment of people be tolerated. It has been during the war, never. Never except in Eastern Europe. As the world powers cheered freedom, they condemned us to hell. It is very hard for me to relate to you now that I am an adult, what it was like to live for almost 3 years as the property of someone else. At the time, I was unaware of what was happening. Not until my teen years did I understand a lot of things that had gone on in my early childhood and why. For many years, when I talked about the above incident or any other incident that had occurred in concentration camp, I would start to shake and cry. Not until I started to write about it was I able to tell my story with an emotional somewhat under control. We had been considered non-human and dealt with as less than animals. Animals to abuse and to destroy at the whim of the others. At the whim of Marshal Tito's partisans, the guards had been told they could do whatever they wanted with us. This place that we were taken to, I depicted, right here is a copy of the picture that you will find in the art gallery, is the only piece of art I have ever done pertaining to this subject. And when I did this at Harper College. I took a figure drawing class, and the teacher told us our homework assignment was to go home and to make a statement. So this was my statement. And not until that time, I went home, I drew the face of this child, that is me. Did I ever think of myself as a child? Because you never think of yourself as a child, it's always you. And for the first time, when I finished the picture, I looked into those eyes and I started to cry uncontrollably because I realized how could they do this to children? And the saddest part is I'm standing here. They're still doing this to children in all over the world. And we just don't know about it. And this is our story. Nobody knows very much about this either. We were put in this airplane hangar, 4,000 of us. At the beginning, the airplane hangar was nothing but a metal building, dirt floor. We were all huddled, all the families were huddled around each other. We slept on the floor. I got such a bad eye infection that every night when I went to bed, I was afraid to fall asleep because the next morning, my eyes would be glued shut with pus. And all my mother could do was take a rag and wet it with water and soak my eyes because we had no soap, we had nothing. And this was a ritual that went on for a week, 2 weeks. Our toilet facility was outside. It was a ditch that was a yard wide and 30 feet long, and that's where we relieved ourselves. If the sun shone, if the rain came down, if the snow came down, this is where we had to use our facilities. I was very afraid of the ditch, not because I was embarrassed, but I was afraid of falling in. Our daily rationing was a soup that consisted of gray matter with a few barleys in it, no salt. And then we had cornbread, which was made from cracked corn. It was so hard you had to dunk it into the soup to be able to chew it. And sometimes they gave us pea soup, which was green, and the peas had maggots in it. You would bite on it and you would get cracking sound. And it took me a long, long time in my life to eat pea soup. And every day, the women, this was a work camp. This was not a starvation camp where my grandparents ended up in Yugoslavs, where it was strictly for annihilation. But this was a work camp. Every morning, the women had to report outside like soldiers, and sometimes, I have to admit, I snuck out and watched. They had to stand at attention. Then the commissar, or whoever was in charge, would say his little communist speech, and then when he was done, they had to take their right hand and make a fist and scream "Živio Tito" 3 times, which means "Long live Tito," and then they were marched out to wherever they were assigned to. At the beginning, the women had to go and empty out all the houses. All the livestock was put in one place. All the furniture was put in one place. All the clothing was put in one place. And then other people were brought in to take over our houses. Women could be bought. People could come to the gate and buy them as a slave. And they could do whatever they wanted with them as long as they returned them. They didn't ask what they did with them every day. And this was life in concentration camp. I, being